Real quick, before we dive into today's episode, enrollment is closing soon for my signature course, 3-Act Story. This is your step-by-step framework for shaping a clear, compelling story that actually goes the distance. No matter where you are, idea stage, messy draft, or deep revision, you'll learn how to take your story from beginning to end with step-by-step training, worksheets, live Q&As, and a private community to keep you moving. Enrollment closes this Thursday, October 9th at 8 p.m. Eastern. Don't wait. Get all the details at 3actstory.me. That's the number 3, 3actstory.me. I can't wait to welcome you inside. Every day you sit down to write, you face 1,000 choices. What should happen next? How should your character react? Where should this scene take place? When you understand structure, you have a compass that points you toward the choices that serve your story. Writer Unleashed is for you, a writer who has a story you want to bring onto the page and into the hearts and minds of readers. I'm Nancy Panuccio, writer, editor, and book coach. Each week, we'll explore techniques, mindsets, and inspiration for writing stories readers can't put down. Thanks for spending some time with me today. Now, let's begin. Okay. You know you need to structure your story. You're not one of those writers who thinks you can just wing it and hope for the best. You understand that readers expect certain things from a story, that there are patterns that work and patterns that don't. But here's the problem. Knowing you need structure and knowing how to structure your story are two completely different things. And that gap, that frustrating, overwhelming gap between knowing what you should do and knowing how to actually do it is what's probably keeping you stuck, overwhelmed, revising in circles, or starting but never finishing. If you've ever felt like you're drowning in conflicting advice about story structure, if you've tried different approaches and felt more confused than when you started, this episode is for you. I'll walk you through how to think about structure in a way that feels clear, flexible, and actually helps you bring your story to the finish line. Because what typically happens is you start researching story structure because you know you need it. You find Save the Cat and you think, great, a proven formula. But then you try to fit your quiet, character-driven novel into those beat sheets, and it feels like trying to squeeze an elephant into skinny jeans. So you try the hero's journey. Surely this classic approach will work, but your memoir about overcoming anxiety doesn't have a magical sword or a mentor with mystical powers, and you start to wonder if it's you, if you're doing something wrong. Or maybe you've read that structure should be invisible, that it should just flow naturally, that you should write an exploratory draft with no worry about structure until it's time to revise. Big mistake. Or you study your favorite books, trying to reverse engineer their structure, but every book seems to do it differently, and you end up more confused than when you started. Here's what I want to tell you. You're not failing at structure. If you've been writing your story for a while, most likely your structural elements are already there. They may be hidden, but you just need to identify them and then discard anything that doesn't fit. The structure advice you've been given is failing you. It's either broken up into every microbeat, which can be paralyzing, or it doesn't tell you actually how to write it. It doesn't give you the storytelling techniques that make the structures work. Most structure advice fails aspiring writers for 3 reasons. First, it's too genre specific. Save the Cat, for example, was designed for Hollywood action movies. The problem with beat sheet formulas like Save the Cat is that they're diagnostic tools, not creative ones. They're helpful after you've written your story, but they don't guide you while you're shaping the story itself. The hero's journey works great for epic fantasies and adventures, but what if you're writing literary fiction, a memoir about family trauma, a romance? These formulas weren't built for your story, so of course they don't fit. These kinds of structures are templates, but not a thinking process. It doesn't help you make the deeper decisions about your character's struggle, or how the story should evolve as you write. Second, it's too rigid. Many structure approaches give you a detailed beat sheet, but what if you're writing a memoir that starts with childhood and your real story doesn't begin until you're an adult? I find that beat sheets are not helpful to most writers. They slice and dice the story before you've written it, rather than expand and deepen your story. So rigid formulas break when real stories don't conform. Third, it's too vague. Your story needs a beginning, middle, and end, and all of these structures are 3-act structures. But what makes a beginning feel complete? How do you introduce your protagonist and supporting characters? How do you keep a middle from sagging and falling apart? What makes an ending satisfying? Knowing you need 3 acts doesn't tell you how to build them. And then writers start to think they're the problem. Maybe my story isn't strong enough. Maybe I'm not a real writer. Maybe my story doesn't even deserve to be told. That's completely backwards. Your story absolutely deserves to be told. You just need a framework that actually helps instead of confuses you more. And you definitely don't need a paint-by-numbers approach. Here's what I've learned from working with hundreds of writers who want to finish their books. The best structure is flexible enough to fit any story, but specific enough to actually guide your decisions. For example, when an architect designs a house, they don't start with where should the doorknobs go. They start with the foundation, the load-bearing walls, the basic flow from room to room. Once that framework is solid, they can put the doorknobs anywhere they want. Story structure works the same way. You need to understand the fundamental framework. What makes readers feel satisfied, how emotional arcs work, where the natural turning points fall. But within that framework, you have infinite creative freedom. For example, a good GPS doesn't control your driving. It doesn't force you to take specific streets or stop at certain places. It just shows you the most efficient route to your destination. And if you want to take a detour, it recalculates and gets you back on track. That's what good story structure does. It keeps you oriented toward your destination, a satisfying, moving ending, while giving you complete freedom about how you get there. Here are some questions I've been getting in my free masterclasses. What about books that don't follow traditional structures? In other words, if my story doesn't fit the mold, how do I structure it? But even unconventional meditative stories have a structural framework. The trick is learning to see it, to identify it. Because the 3-act structure, in simple terms, is the setup, the struggle, and the transformation. It's not a rigid formula. It's a way of understanding movement and character change. Every story, even the quietest or experimental, has some kind of movement from beginning to end. For example, the novel Orbital has a meditative intellectual lens, but there's still an underlying arc. Time is passing. There are shifts in awareness, a reckoning with mortality. In the novel Audition, this is more internal and psychological, but still has mounting tension and a hinge point where everything tilts. So even with what seems to be unstructured books have turning points, a moment of destabilization, a midpoint of deeper questioning, a final transformation. Great structure doesn't call attention to itself. The reader's not concerned with structure. They subconsciously expect patterns, and structure tracks the patterns of character change. Even experimental or meditative or memoir still center on pursuit. It could be understanding, belonging, clarity, redemption, reconciliation. So they still center on pursuit. So if your story feels too quiet, ask, what's my character struggling toward, even if it's invisible on the outside? Here's another smart question that I got during my masterclass, and it's a common question I get from writers working on historical novels or memoir or any story that travels a long time span. My story covers a long period of time. How do I tell it without dragging it out? It's such a smart question because the instinct is to think if my story spans years or decades, I have to include it all. But readers don't need every year. They need the arc of transformation that unfolds across that time. The key is to identify the period of change that truly defines your story. That becomes your through line. Everything before it becomes significant history or backstory, and everything after it becomes resolution. Structure helps you compress time. You can leap months or years between scenes as long as the emotional or narrative thread stays clear. What matters isn't how much time passes, it's what changes in your character's pursuit, belief, or relationship to the central question of the story. So rather than trying to cover a long period, think about distilling it. Choose the key turning points that carry emotional weight and let structure do the work of holding that passage of time. That's what keeps a sweeping story tight and alive. Another misconception that keeps writers stuck is thinking that you don't have enough material to even begin thinking about structure. You may be great at starting stories, but you run out of ideas quickly and end up revising the same pages over and over and over. And you think you need more material in order for structure to be beneficial. That belief is so common, but it's also exactly what keeps writers stuck. More material isn't the solution. More structure is. Without a framework, your ideas just fizzle out. So if you've been putting off starting because you think you need a pile of chapters first, I want you to know you're ready now. You don't need more words on the page. You need a path that shows you how to take your idea and expand it and shape it. So your story doesn't need explosions or car chases to have shape. What matters is the shift your character makes and the way you carry the reader through that journey. Good story structure does 3 things for you as a writer. First, it gives you confidence. When you understand where your story is going, you can write boldly. You can take creative risks because you know you have a solid foundation to land on. You're not constantly second-guessing yourself or wondering if you're wasting time going down the wrong path, what to include, what to leave out. Second, it creates reader satisfaction. This isn't about following formulas. It's about understanding how human psychology works. We're wired to respond to certain story patterns. When you understand these patterns, you can use them to create the emotional experience you want your readers to have. Third, it helps you make decisions. Every day you sit down to write, you face 1,000 choices. What should happen next? How should your character react? Where should this scene take place? When you understand structure, You have a compass that points you toward the choices that serve your story. And here's what I see happening with first-time authors. They know they need structure, so they try to learn it. They try to go to off-the-shelf structures. It's like trying to learn to drive by reading the manual for a motorcycle, then a boat, then an airplane. They're all vehicles, but the instructions don't work for what you're actually trying to do. The result? You end up more confused than when you started. You try to force your story into structures that just don't fit. You second guess your instincts. You start and stop and restart, never feeling confident about the choices you're making. I see this all the time. Writers who have compelling characters and beautiful prose, who start with incredible enthusiasm, but then abandon their books around page 50 or 100 because they don't know where they're going or how to get there. And the tragic part is, these are often the writers with the most important stories to tell. But once these writers learn structure that actually fits their story and their process, everything changes. They write with confidence, they finish their books, and they write books that readers can't put down. So the solution isn't to avoid structure or to follow a paint-by-numbers beat sheet. The solution is to learn structure that actually works for your story. Structure that doesn't constrict your story, but expands it. It opens it up and gives it room to breathe. Structure that's flexible enough to fit any story, a novel or memoir, literary or commercial, planned or discovered. Structure that's specific enough to guide your daily writing decisions, what should happen next, how to build toward your climax, how to keep readers turning pages. Structure that's designed for real writers writing real books, not Hollywood executives making formulaic movies. Okay, so let's recap. Good story structure does 3 things. It gives you confidence. You know where you're going, so you can write boldly. Number 2, it creates reader satisfaction. Humans are wired to respond to certain story patterns. And number 3, it helps you make decisions. It puts you in control. When you're unsure what happens next, structure gives you guidance. So if you're ready to stop writing in the dark and start writing with the confidence that comes from understanding story structure, I'd love to help you. I have one more free masterclass tomorrow, Wednesday, October 8th, 7 p.m. Eastern. It's called From Chaos to Clarity, a 3-part framework for finally finishing your story. You can register for that free masterclass at mylivemasterclass.com. mylivemasterclass.com. This is the last free masterclass I'm giving, and there's no replay, so show up live. I'd love to help you stop rewriting the same pages and start building the book you've been dreaming about. So there you have it. Thanks for hanging out with me today. If you know any writers who need some support in their writing, please share this episode or the Writer Unleashed podcast in general. And if you love what you're listening to, subscribe on your favorite listening platform. And if you're listening on Apple, please leave me a review. Reading how this podcast impacts your writing truly lights me up and helps me create topics for the show. Till next time, keep writing, and I'll talk to you soon.